So real quick, my name is Isa. I'm a software engineer also at Capital One down the street. I actually don't work in card. I work on the digital messaging team, or DMS team. So we basically handle mostly configurations for basically text messages and emails and those kind of things. But I won't be discussing anything related to that. Today I'll just be discussing regular old web app development and how to use really popular Google tools for that with other third-party apps. So thanks for hanging out, and welcome to Experiences with Firebase and Component-Based Web App Development. So even though the name is somewhat self-explanatory, I'm sorry, this computer is someone else's. I'm a little, yeah. Okay, there we go. So even though the title is somewhat self-explanatory, you're probably wondering, what is this talk about? What is the central purpose of this talk? So if you've been to other DevFests, you've probably gotten a good idea of how well Google products kind of interact with each other, and also how they work in isolation. Some good examples of other, I guess, Google-based product talks that you've probably heard would be discussions on how Firebase works with Angular 6, how Flutter works with Firebase, and how TensorFlow or Go work with basically anything. However, the reality is most developers don't choose tools based on their association with bigger companies or on the amount of buzz the tool generates. Most people do it for kind of the reasons that are written above. They choose their tools based on the project size. If you're looking for something that works for a smaller app, you may not want something like a bigger framework to go with that. You might just want kind of individual stuff to add to it. And also based on the features that are available for certain things. If you're working with a CSS framework, you may say you don't need specific things like, I guess, modules for dialogues or something like that, in which case you might use something that's a bit simpler. Also, the amount of time you have, the amount of setup it takes to put together any of these apps kind of varies based on what it is you're using, and also the learning curve. Most of the time, it's easier to pick up something that's similar to something that you've already used before. But if you're creating an app for learning purposes, that can take a bit longer, and you might be able to have that extra time to kind of use that. And because of that, you'll sometimes use other third-party tools with things like Angular or Flutter or Firebase. Some other popular tools that are used with Firebase might include different front-end JavaScript frameworks like React, Preact, Vue, those kind of things, super popular. Query languages like GraphQL, a bunch of languages that you can use to, I guess, compile things down to JavaScript like Elm or TypeScript, and also state management tools like Flux, React, or MobX, none of which are actually features on here, but you guys kind of get the gist. And that's when things can get a little swirly, and you kind of have to rely on outside random resources, anything from videos that you might find on the internet to blogs or to podcasts, which is all great, but you can't always know whether the resources you're using are kind of worth the effort and time and effort to use them, or whether the tools you're working with kind of work together with other things. And when it comes to that, sometimes it helps to basically figure out what works with something else based on someone else's experience. And that, in essence, is what this purpose of this talk is. It's to give you an idea of how Firebase works specifically, in this case, with Vue.js, which was the framework I basically chose to use to work on a side project. Just a minor note, in addition to discussing specifically the technologies themselves, Firebase and Vue, I'm also going to be going into why I chose to use those specific tools in the first place. Because it does matter when you're deciding to put together an app, the reasons behind using those specific tools. So with that, I'm going to, I guess, kind of go into the why of Firebase and Vue and what I chose to use them for. Little background history. A little over a year ago, I was working at the Washington Post, and I was mainly working on putting together middleware using Python. I didn't really get to touch a lot of the UI stuff that I'd done before. It ended up being completely separate, and I kind of wanted to, at some point, update those skills and for them to not become completely deprecated because I was working with other technologies. So I decided I would put together a side project for the purposes of updating my online portfolio and also kind of learning to use Vue tools. Like a lot of people, it was pretty easy for me to come up with the side project concept just because I do sometimes see certain things in certain products where I know issues can be solved using technology. Oftentimes I normally won't touch them because they're not things that are always easily implemented or actionable, but they always do exist, and this is one of those cases where I kind of had to dig into that. One of those concepts at the time was based on the proliferation of online learning tools. Pretty much everyone and their mom is trying to learn to code right now, and there are tons of different tools out there and different popular websites to do them from. Those include ones like Coursera, Udemy and Udacity, Code Academy, Code School, all the stuff that's listed here and then some. What I wanted to do was to create one website that people could use to determine which of these sites works best based on the amount of time they have, the amount of money they have available, and also what their learning style is. If you are more of a video-based learning kind of person, things like Udacity and Code School would probably work really well for you because a lot of them use that as a means of teaching you the concept. If you're the kind of person who needs to jump into something and really do the actual project, which most people are to some extent, but some to more than the others, things like Code Academy and General Assembly Dash would probably work really well for you. I wanted to make it easy for people who were completely new to all this and are like, what are all these things, to kind of figure out what works best for them. So that was my general concept. Once I had that concept, it was time to collect data. Some people might put together scraping tools to kind of go through websites and kind of collect their data that way. I personally chose to do it manually and to just kind of go through sites and kind of decide on what it was that I needed. And just doing that alone kind of helped me kind of narrow down the scope of what it was I was trying to build. Initially, I wanted to include things like boot camps. And then I realized that besides the fact that there were other websites that kind of already made it so that you could figure out how to put those together, it also seemed like there were a lot of different variant aspects of them that made it so that it was difficult to kind of split those between online resources. So I decided to focus specifically on tools that were specific for online and pretty much online only. And that was kind of how I managed to narrow things down. And it also helped me narrow down the categories I wanted to at least initially focus on. After that, I had to decide on what kind of product this was going to be. I kind of already had an idea in my head for what it was. I knew it was going to be a responsive web app because at the end of the day, while you can use mobile apps to do all kinds of cool things like check your bank account and those kind of things, when it comes to actually learning to build programs for things like that, the best tool at the end of the day is still an actual computer. So I decided I would do a standard responsive web app. And because of that, it automatically basically eliminated a lot of different tools that I would not use. I knew I wasn't going to be using Xamarin or Cordova or Ionic or React Native or anything for mobile development like that. And obviously, I wasn't going to touch on tools that you would use for VR, AR, MR, or Internet of Things or any of that. So that was an easy way to narrow down probably hundreds and hundreds of different tools. After that, it was time to figure out how I was going to actually build this app. And I did that by essentially deciding on what kinds of tools I was going to need for them first. Initially, I started with the front end, and for me, I knew that it would probably be good to decide on a CSS naming strategy from the get-go, so I didn't have to worry about coming back to the app 2 years later and being like, what does this mean? I don't understand. So I definitely wanted to look into that and figuring out how to have a naming strategy that worked for the products that I was putting together. I also wanted to use a CSS framework just so I didn't have to go through, I guess, building modules and things that were already coming or already came in packages that I could use, and I didn't have to do it from scratch, which would take forever. And of course, a CSS processor, just because I didn't want to deal with plain CSS. I mean, why would you? And also a JavaScript framework since I was working with data. And also JavaScript testing tools so that I could make sure things were working functionally and weren't breaking before I ended up deploying them. And to bundle all that together, you need a task runner. Great, that was the front end. For the back end, I knew that my options when it comes to languages were going to be very different, which was great. If I decided I wanted to do something other than JavaScript, I could do that. But in addition to that, it would have to be a language that worked well with a specific framework, whichever one was kind of built to be in use with that language, and that would handle the full stack of the app development. And also had to choose a database, somewhere to actually store this content. I knew eventually at some point I would have to start making decisions on how to deploy the app and also where to host it, but I decided to kind of leave that on the back burner until I had something that resembled a functioning product, and then I would figure that out when I got to that stage. So after deciding on the types of tools, I had to decide on the options I had for each type. One good example of that would be what I did for JavaScript frameworks. If we're being completely honest, there are probably hundreds of different options that I had. Ooh, now the mic's working. Okay, several different options that I had with JS frameworks alone. But I decided to narrow it down to ones that I knew that I could get lots of information and that I knew had a full community and real backing to actually work with. So that narrowed it down for me specifically to Angular 1, Angular 2, React, and Vue.js. I decided against Angular 1 for obvious reasons. It was a very large framework for something that was essentially, at the initial stages, a relatively small app. And it was pretty difficult to work with at the time and compared to what was coming out. I did have a lot of background experience with it, so the learning curve wouldn't have been as bad. But the purpose of this was to get comfortable with newer kind of front-end tools. So I decided to leave that alone. Angular 2 was also an option, but that was another one that was very large, and it had its own higher learning curve that was separate from what I was learning with Angular 1. And it had a lot of features that I knew I probably wasn't going to need. So there was React, which is super popular and has a huge, I guess, organization behind it and tons of great resources. But one thing that concerned me at the time was that I knew that I would have to learn to use JSX with it. And back then, this was before I had a little bit of experience with React and those kind of things. To me, it seemed like I would be essentially learning a brand new language for this framework alone. It's actually not that difficult. JSX is actually really easy to pick up. But at the time, it was a concern. So I started looking a little more, and one thing I noticed was that anytime I was looking at comparison blogs on certain things, specifically between Angular 2, React, and Vue, most of the people seem to prefer Vue. They seem to think the learning curve was relatively easy. Anyone could kind of jump in and kind of learn that. Specifically because there were no compiled languages, and it was just straight up JavaScript and regular templating, so it was pretty easy to pick up. And also, it was very, very reactive, so it moves super fast, slightly faster than even React, which says a lot. And it had its own specific set of state management tools and kind of server-side rendering tools that were specific to Vue. So I decided to give that one a shot. So this is basically what the notebook looked like, or what my notebook looked like when I was kind of deciding between individual tools. I could have, of course, kind of just written things down and kind of crossed them out on my actual computer. But I don't know, there's something somewhat satisfying to being able to circle and scratch things out. So that's kind of what I did manually. It was somewhat sloppy, but it was super effective. And these were my essential decisions once I'd kind of gone through the full process for all of those things. I decided specifically to use BEM, or a block element modifier, as a naming strategy, which kind of allows you to decide on the names of your classes based on the blocks within the page that you decide to section it as, and also the elements within those blocks, and also how you modify them. So if a button is going to be red for some reason because it's a stop button, then you can say dash dash stop. And if it's not, then you don't have that attachment to it. For CSS frameworks, I decided on Materialize because it was the only CSS framework I could see based on my research that actually had an entire design strategy behind it. It wasn't something that was just used for the purpose of basically making it easier to make things look good. There was usability reasons behind the entire strategy for Materialize. And Sass was the de facto default for preprocessors at this point. Yeah, technically you can use less, but most products are kind of configured to work with Sass. And of course, I told you all the reasons I chose Vue.js. For testing frameworks, this was before things like Cypress and Jest got really, really huge for like snapshot testing. And at that time, the de facto standard was, once again, Mocha Karma Chai. So those were my decisions for the front end. And this is probably the part that's probably going to confuse you a bit. And that's because initially when I was creating this project, I wasn't originally thinking of throwing things into a backend as a service, software service. I was initially considering putting together the server myself and the database and doing every single thing manually. And I decided I wanted to go full JavaScript and just use JavaScript language, use Node and Express, and then MongoDB. And then I actually started working on it and realized at a certain point that it was spending more time putting together just the back end by itself than I was looking at the front end in any capacity. And the point of this was to kind of take myself away from the back end work I was doing at my job and kind of get comfortable with my front end stuff. And that's when I had to kind of stop and pause for a second and seriously think about ways to kind of make it so that I could leave that part of the process alone and kind of focus on UI development. And that is when I decided to use Firebase. For me, Firebase was a pretty obvious choice just because while I knew other backend as a service products existed, most of them seemed to be geared towards mobile development. They weren't specifically for web app development, and virtually none of them were as, I guess, mature and had as huge a community as Firebase did. I knew there would be tons of resources on it because it was such a well-known name. And it was also, of course, attached to a larger company that was able to basically keep up with the entire process. So after that came actual implementation. The one good thing that came out of initially trying to put things together manually using Express and those kind of things was that when I was initially putting together the app, I wanted to start with the server. And that meant that I ended up taking all of the data that I collected inside my Google Sheets and putting them into a JSON object just for testing purposes before I was actually going to put together the MongoDB database. So I actually had a set of data that I could essentially upload into Firebase instead of sitting there and manually kind of adding my key and value pairs in it. And Firebase makes it pretty easy for you to do that. There's actually a kind of extension that you can use to do that. And this is what it ended up looking like. It wasn't a very difficult process, but there was one issue I did run into when I was attempting to upload it. And that was that the keys had to be UTF-8 and ASCII, or UTF-8 encoded and ASCII compliant, which meant that I couldn't use certain specific characters like periods, $signs, hashes, brackets, or forward slashes. So I did have to somewhat modify my data somewhat to not include those. It's just something to think about, that certain things that are allowed in JSON aren't always allowed in the backend as a service product that you might be using. So that was an issue I came up with that I ended up having to work around. So after that, it came time to put together the Vue project itself. I initially planned on manually setting everything up in Webpack and literally putting together my package.json file myself and handling all the configurations. But it didn't take long for me to realize that that wasn't necessary because Vue, like a lot of frameworks, had its own CLI. And the Vue CLI is basically a scaffolding tool that's used to set up new projects. And it handles pretty much all of the Webpack configurations for you and makes it really easy to configure a project to your specific specifications. At the time that I was putting together the project when trying to implement it, there were different implementations and different options that you could set the project up in. You could set it up using Browserify. Webpack was also an option, and within those, there were simple and complex versions. And you could even set things up as PWAs, or progressive web apps, which was very cool. I, of course, decided on Webpack before I'd even started the project, so it was obvious I was going to do that implementation. And I essentially installed the Vue CLI via the terminal. And then I ran the Vue create project command, and it pretty much scaffolded everything for me. It asked me if I wanted specific testing tools, but that was pretty much all that was really necessary to get a project scaffolded. So before I jump into specifically Vue, I do want to go over some Vue basics, because when I was going over this with a friend, I kind of realized not everyone is specifically familiar with Vue or even with component-based app development, so I should probably go over some basics when it comes to that. The difference between Vue and a lot of the newer frameworks coming out right now is that it is considered a component-based architecture app, as opposed to older frameworks, which are MVC apps, similar to kind of what you would see with backend apps. And what that means is that the data and the responsibilities with old model view controller apps was kind of split horizontally, and that things ran from the model through the controller into the view. And with component-based apps, the responsibilities are kind of split vertically. So you can kind of split things based on how they're kind of set up in your view, and you can kind of organize your code based on that instead of based on where the data is coming from. Components can specifically refer to full pages that are kind of tied to actual routes, and they can also refer to specific modules within a page and how they interact with data in a specific way. The kind of decision on how that works kind of is up to you. This, I guess, would be somewhat of an example of how, I guess, the folder structure kind of would move. First, you would have the full app, and this is for MVC specifically, which is what you're looking at on your right. You would have the full app, and then you would have one kind of directory for your JavaScript files, and that would have a model in it and a controller, not necessarily a view. And it might have a view, but it wouldn't be necessarily in the same kind of directory. And then you would have your Sass and your unit tests on the outside, and that made it so that when you were working on something specific in a page, you kind of had to basically search for whatever specific kind of information you were trying to work, or specific code that you were trying to refactor and work with. With component-based apps, within the app, everything is split up by component names. And then within those component directories, you have all of the code that is kind of associated with that specific component in the page. So your JavaScript, your Sass, your unit tests, and your HTML will all be within one directory. And if it is specifically for the header, it's going to have basically all of the code related to that header. And you can reuse that component in different parts of your app. This is kind of the big part that really separates it, is that pretty much by componentizing pretty much every single part of your app, you can reuse a lot of the components in different areas instead of having to like rewrite things. Okay, so you're probably thinking, that's great and all, but doesn't React do this too? Doesn't Angular 2 kind of sort of do these things too? And it kind of does. I like to think of Vue as kind of a framework that kind of takes the entire component-based architecture, I guess, philosophy, and it puts it on roids, because it basically takes it and instead of making it so that all of the code is organized specifically based on the directory, you're actually able to isolate it to one file, to the Vue.js file, which initially when you're thinking about it can make it seem like, oh, this is going to give us really super long files. But when you're working with smaller components and smaller amounts of codes, it actually makes it easier to kind of organize content. So what you're looking at is a super simplified version of a Vue component. If you had a component that was called testing, for I guess testing stuff, and And then you could basically envelope all of your HTML into the template tags. And in there you would have your HTML, your classes, your expressions, your directives, which are also a thing in Vue like they are in Angular. And you can kind of contain that there. And if you decided you want to attach data or filter data through it, instead of going outside of the document or outside of the actual, I guess, file itself, you can literally put things that are specific to that exact, or data that's specific to that exact component directly into the file itself through its script tags. You can actually export data from different places. This is an example of how you would export it from, I guess, a store state management tool, which I'll get into later. In addition to adding all of that information into the actual app itself, or into the app component itself, I had to put it into the main.js file. And the main file, I basically had to import pretty much everything into that. As you can see, there's a lot of importing all of the excess components that I was putting into the Vue app. In addition to importing those, which that's very Vue specific, I also had to import kind of an integration tool called Modifier. It's a little similar to AngularFire in that it kind of makes it easier for you to implement Vue or to implement Firebase within your Vue app. So I had to import that library, as well as some other stuff, Vue material, but I'll discuss that later. And I also had to start the actual Vue, or to actually use the Vue product within the actual main.js app. And this is basically what came out when I was doing that, and I was super, super happy when I finally had data coming in, or hot loading into the actual screen. And all of that was great. I could even review the data from basically any route I went to. The problem was the data looked exactly the same in every single route because it was put into the main app.vue file. And yes, technically I could sit there and I could edit all of the information based on the route it was on, but I knew that at some point I would run into issues with the state of the data getting, I guess, kind of somewhat discombobulated. And a way to get away from that would have been to go ahead and kind of implement Firebase into each of the specific apps, but then I would still end up running into state management issues. And that's when I decided to implement a state management tool within my app. Thankfully, Vue has its own specific state management tool called Vuex. So Vuex is a tool that is based off of React's original state management tool, Flux. It allows you to get data, to mutate it, and to perform actions on it, and to also have one centralized state for the actual data itself, so that you're kind of mutating the data and you're not actually kind of making a big mess. It's pretty easy to install that in your app using npm. Literally npm install Vuex, and it's officially available in your product. 5 minutes. Okay. So it took a little longer to go through all this than I expected it to. I'm just going to kind of run through everything real quickly as fast as I can. So in addition to doing all of that, I also had to go through a whole bunch of things to actually implement it and to actually get the store to work in conjunction with Firebase and with Vue. I had to create a store file. I had to go through all the setup to put that together as well, adding the getters, the mutations, and then exporting it. And then I had to put it specifically into my main.js file, which is what you see on the left. I also had to basically remove the original Firebase information that I had in my main app component and kind of leave that alone and leave it pristine, since I wanted it to go into separate components. And I had to go back into my main.js file again and kind of essentially add the store to the Vue object itself, and also map getters and add Firebase, the actual Firebase database to it. And then in order to actually make it visible through the actual Vue, I had to essentially take the computed value of the actual store, and kind of return the store with the actual name. A lot of this is also fake, but it was kind of an example that I wanted to show. And then I had to add it to the template using expressions and directives and those kind of things like you would in a regular app whenever you're working with data. So all of this took a lot. It was kind of difficult to kind of find information on all of these kind of things, especially when you're trying to put all three of them together, but I did eventually manage to fully integrate all three of the tools. In addition to working with Vue, Firebase, and Vuex, I also added Vue material, kind of as my CSS. It's specifically the Vue implementation of the Materialize framework. I also added Nightwatch, which kind of somewhat came by default, but you had the option of not including it. And I used that as an end-to-end testing framework, which I initially didn't think about, but decided to keep within the project. I used Karma, Mocha, and Chai, which were also kind of de facto settings that you were allowed to use. And a bunch of other stuff that was in my package.html file that I can't remember right now, but you guys kind of get the gist. So the status of the project right now is that it's currently still in progress. What I plan to do in the future is kind of fix some dependency issues that kind of popped up when I essentially tried to upgrade some of my older products and ran into issues with the Vue.js external framework that I was using. I'm most likely going to end up refactoring a lot of that code and essentially writing my own Firebase bindings, or Firebase Vuex bindings. And UI-wise, I plan to eventually create and implement a search so that you can actually search for specific data kind of based on what you put in a search bar. And also I plan to add a form for submitting new learning tool ideas. If a new website pops up, someone else sees it and decides, oh, this would be a great thing to add to this project, they can essentially fill out the form and it will kind of default information to what I need. And then eventually I want to add user authentication and then deploy it and go live. So that's what I plan to do with my first iteration. The takeaway or lessons learned I had from these was, of course, it kind of drove home the idea that development is an ongoing process. It never really stops. There's always something new to work on, even if you're just trying to maintain what it is you have. I also realized that creating fully functional software takes more than just code and more than just development. The thought process behind what you use and how you use it, all of that also matters. I also realized that not only are unforeseen issues normal, but they're also kind of essential to figuring out how a product works. And in addition to that, I kind of realized that there's a reason why certain tools kind of take off and certain ones don't. And that sometimes using well-established tools like Firebase kind of make it a lot easier to learn different concepts that you might not be as familiar with. And it definitely makes debugging easier. So, learning resources, if you decided that you want to go out and mess with some of these different tools, I would definitely suggest starting with the documentation, especially for Vue.js. They have really great documentation. There was actually a guy who went over like this tool that the founder of Vue actually put together to kind of create your own documentation earlier. It was very great. I definitely would suggest going back and looking at a video of it if you ever see it. In addition to that, if you're looking for good places to find integration tools, I would say to start at the Vue GitHub account, where it has all kinds of different implementations or different ways to integrate Vue with different things like, specifically, like if you decided you didn't want to use Materialize and you want to use Bootstrap as an implementation for that, all those different things. And for YouTube channels, for more specifics on how to integrate those different things, I would definitely say look at Academind and Coding the Smart Way. The second one is kind of my favorite because the dude who runs the site for some reason always seems to be a few months ahead of me when it came to kind of implementing a certain tool. So it's super convenient. All right, that is all I have. I'm about to get kicked out anyway. Thanks for coming. You can follow me at iConteh21 at Twitter, or you can email me whenever I'm around. I work down the street. So thanks.